Hey, Stacey David here, and this is the Tales of a Gearhead podcast. This podcast is brought to you by Cornwell Tools, the choice of professionals since 1919. That's right, over 100 years building tools and still going strong. If you need tools, check them out. You won't be disappointed. All right, let's get rolling. All right, today we're going to jump into a question that we get a lot, man. People want to discuss it and they want to talk about it. And it has to do with clones or replicas or tribute cars. Whatever you want to call them, anything to not call them a fake. Nobody wants to call their car a fake. We are all influenced by something. So it is a natural thing for somebody to go, hey man, my uncle had this red Corvette when I was a kid, and I want to duplicate that car. Man, there's nothing wrong with that. One of the first cars that I wanted to do, I saw American Graffiti when I was like 9 years old, man. And I had to have a yellow coupe like that. And the car that I drove in high school was my best rendition of that yellow 32 coupe. Now, mine was a 30, and it was painted yellow, and it was a piece of crap. But it was not a real 32. It was not the one from the movie. And it was very obvious that it was just a clone or a replica of a car that I liked. And there's nothing wrong with that. The problem comes when people start to present it as authentic. Some of you out there, if you haven't been into this very much, you might be thinking, well, what's the harm in that? Well, let me explain it to you. And this all grew out of the auction world and the collector world. For the longest time, cars that were the most collectible were ones that were rarely optioned. And I'm talking muscle cars now. So when you had a Coronet or a Satellite, let's say a 68 Satellite, it wasn't worth very much. It was a Satellite. But when you start adding the GTX package and a Hemi and a 4-speed, well, each one of those bits add a value to that car, tremendous value, depending on the market at the time. And then there's other options like the color and the interior and the striping package or the deleted striping package. These all add tremendous value. And unscrupulous people years ago found out that, hey, I can counterfeit one of those cars and sell it to you under the guise that it might be authentic. And that's how that was born. And that is fraud. You'll go to jail for that. That is not legal to do something like that. So that's where this kind of started. Now, obviously, if you've always wanted like a Chevelle SS and you can't afford a real one, and they're $100,000, and you can buy a Malibu for $10,000 and have your version of an SS for half the price. Listen, there's not a problem doing that as long as you don't try to pass it off as authentic, because that's where it starts to become a problem and it becomes illegal. And this is where the resto mod thing came from. Say if you had a Chevelle or even a Cuda or something like that, and you wanted to put the special stripes on it, but then you lowered the suspension and you put different wheels and tires on it and that kind of thing. Well, it's obvious it's not a numbers matching car, which is where all of this authenticity is really valuable. The big issue here is when somebody comes up and they start to fudge just a little bit. And it's human nature to do this. Nobody wants to call their car a fake. So say you picked up a CJ5 and it's got the big eagle on it and everything, and they're saying it's the Eagle Edition. Or, they picked up a Firebird and they put the Trans Am stuff on it and they're calling it a Trans Am. Well, when you go to resell that thing, you're the one that has to perpetuate the lie. And eventually down the road, somebody starts to go, is that a real Trans Am? And the person starts going, well, it might be. And see, that's, in a lot of people's eyes, not technically a lie. It's a little gray area. But that might be, you go through a couple owners, it becomes it is. And that's how easily that kind of stuff happens. And pretty soon you got a car that's a fraud, where people are like, well, I just figured that it was. No one ever told me otherwise. You've all heard these kind of things. And it's basically somebody not telling you the truth. Now, maybe they don't know, But that's the problem with clones. We had an issue come up just recently that I wanted to share with everybody. If you've seen the shows at all or know some of the stuff that I built over the years, I did a truck called Copperhead about 15 years ago. And it had the very first 572 crate engine in it and a bunch of really special parts. And it was a really cool truck, and it was really a trend-setting truck for the time. That truck is owned by a friend of mine down in Texas, and he's had it for almost 15 years, and he doesn't go out to shows, and he just keeps it in his garage. Well, that's where the real truck is. Now, there are several clones running around, and there's nothing wrong with that. That's very flattering that somebody would want to clone that truck, and I have no problem with people doing that as long as they're very honest that this is a clone. Because it's pretty obvious they are. They don't have the right engine in them or all that special stuff we did. Well, one of the trucks came up at the MECUM auction, and it was purported to be the Copperhead truck. And it said right in the ad, it was featured on the Trucks TV show with me. It mentioned me by name, and it was Project Copperhead. Well, whoever wrote that ad, I don't know if he actually thinks that. This kind of fraudulent stuff could go back a couple owners. Whoever built that truck knew that it was a replica, but how the story is passed down, he could have told the next buyer, like, well, I built it as a tribute to the truck that Stacey did. And then the next guy goes, well, it's just the Copperhead truck. And it's like, well, yeah, it's like the one on the show. And that turns into, well, it is the one on the show. And then other stories start to abound, and pretty soon you got a fraudulent thing happening there. That's what happened with that. And of course, we had to confront it. We got it taken care of. And, the guy knows that what he has is a replica, and all is well with that. Now, the big thing is, how do you protect yourself from these kind of things? They're out there. Man, they're really out there now. Now listen, I want to be really clear. Most of the people, the car guys, the people that are listening to this podcast, you're car people. You would probably never dream of defrauding somebody. But some of the used car salesmen and the guys that are like making money off of these things, they don't care, and they don't have the same ethics, shall we say, that you might have. So it is nothing for them to not necessarily lie to you, but leave out important information. So it's the same kind of thing when you're going to look at a used car. You got to read between the lines, and you got to know what you're looking at. So if you go out and you look at something and it is supposed to be a factory 69 Roadrunner, well, you better have done your research on a 69 Roadrunner. And if you're at an auction and you're not sure, Google it right there and find out what was special about a 69 Roadrunner. Find out what engine options they should have had. Find out the way things looked. Find out how many posts they made, how many hardtops they made, all of these things, and find out about this car and what this car should look like. Be careful on that. Let me tell you a story that happened to me one time. I may have shared this with you. One of my favorite cars of all time. They're all my favorite. But one car that I've always just loved is the 70 through 73 Trans Am and Firebird. I just love that body style. So this was years ago. One came up for sale in the local classified ads, and it was a 70 Trans Am for about $4,500, which at the time was still cheap. But I was like, they were going for about $7,000 at the time. And I was like, man, I need to go check that out. Now, it was about an hour drive. I called the guy up. He's like, yeah, man, it's a 70 Trans Am, and it's just great. It needs restoration. It's not running, but all this other stuff. I'm like, okay. So I go out there. I drive an hour, and I show up, and I pull into the driveway, and there sits this blue, beautiful 70 Firebird with the double snorkel hood on it. It's obviously not a Trans Am. Nice car. So I'm like, okay, so what's up? He goes, well, here's the deal. He said, I had a 70 Trans Am, but it was rusted out. So we pulled all the parts off of it, including the VIN tag, as in the VIN tag. And he showed it. He had it right there in all these parts in the garage. And he said, so I picked up a 70 Firebird, and I was just going to transfer everything over to it. And just, restore my Trans Am that way. So I looked at him and said, okay. So he said, well, I have the paperwork on the Trans Am and the Firebird. And I said, okay, so you have clear title of both, but you want to turn the Firebird into the Trans Am. And I said, why didn't you? And he kind of looked at me and he's like, well, what do you mean? I said, if it's so easy, why didn't you transfer the VIN tags? Why are you giving it to me to do it? I'll tell you exactly why he was doing that, because he knows it was illegal. At the time, it was seriously illegal. That's fraud, man. That's prison time, boy. Yeah, you don't want any of that kind of stuff. And as much as I wanted the car, I'm like, no. Nope, I'm not going to play this game. Now, since that time, with the advent of all of the replacement bodies and things like that, there are ways that you can do this legally and move, VIN tags and stuff, but you need to be in touch with your DMV about that and need to do that correctly, because that right there that he was trying to pull off, that is not something in a lot of states that's still not legal. Say if he would have done that and I would have bought that car under the pretenses that it was a real Trans Am, let's say I would have taken that car and done a full 100-point restoration on it. And then I would have taken it to some auction, and some expert in Trans Ams would have looked at that and said, no, this serial number on the cowl and this indicates that this was not the right car. Somebody rebodied this thing. Well, now everybody's looking at me, especially since I restored it. And you don't want to be in that position, especially if you sold it for big money. Listen, those collectors that are buying those cars for that big money, listen, they have high-powered lawyers as well. So if they buy something and it's fraudulent, oh, believe me, you are going to be in trouble. So you got to be really careful with this stuff. I've talked about this over and over. So I just wanted to warn you guys what to look out for. Just do your due diligence and make sure that you're up on what you're looking for. And on something like the Copperhead truck, you can send in a note or an email right here to the website, and you can authenticate that thing in a second. I'd be glad to do that with anything I've built. And I know most legitimate builders, from Troy Trepanier to Foos to, anybody, they're going to document their stuff. They'll be glad to do some sort of documentation on anything that they have touched or had their hands on. Because, see, that's another thing. Sometimes people will come in and go, well, so-and-so did the interior in this. And that's not true. There's been a lot of times my name has been used on projects I've never even heard of them, where people are just trying to, get more money out of something or whatever. And if you're one of those sort of people that likes to embellish stories, stop it. That's lying. Don't do that. Tell the truth. Tell the truth of what you have. You may have a car that, if you have an Eleanor car, if you have a clone of an Eleanor car and you have no documentation that it's an authentic Eleanor car, don't call it a Eleanor car. Call it what it is. Call it what you know it. That way you're not on the hook for some sort of lie. So hopefully this helps you guys down the road, man. Be careful out there. I talked to a guy the other day, and it wasn't too long before we started talking tools. That always comes up. And he said the stuff on the trucks are just too darn expensive, man. It's just for rich people. And I laughed and I asked him how valuable his time was. And he said he didn't understand the question. And I explained that the more time he spends messing around with cheap, crappy tools, the more time you waste getting nothing done. And time is a commodity we all have in limited supply. And he looked at me and he said, yeah, maybe I'll look into some of those tools on a truck. He won't be disappointed, neither will you. Check him out. All right, I've got a question here that comes from Kurt. And Kurt says, hey, Stacey, I've always heard that if your starter's giving you trouble, you can hit it with a hammer, and sometimes that helps. Is this true? Kurt, it depends on how hard you hit it with a hammer, man. Actually, yeah, rapping on a starter with a hammer can actually knock it loose and make it work. But it's not hitting the starter. That's where people make a mistake. They get in there with a hammer and start wailing on the starter. Now, what you want to hit is the solenoid. You can get in there with like a broom handle and just kind of bang on that solenoid a little bit, and that takes care of it. You don't have to get in there with a hammer and bang on the starter. You'll just crack the housing of the starter and tick off the people that want to rebuild it. But yeah, that can help you out. If your starter's locked up and it's gotten hot and it's not vehicle's not starting. That can work for you, sure. All right, this question comes from Bart, and Bart says, "Hey, Stacey, I'm kind of new to the car restoration world." He said, "I'm looking to get a floor lift in my shop." He said, "I see a lot of these videos where cars have fallen off lifts," and he says, "How do I make sure that doesn't happen?" That is a really good question, Bart. Anybody can buy these lifts, but very few people are actually taught how to use them. Now, there is a certain amount of it that's just kind of common sense. But there are some tricks to using a two-post lift, especially correctly, to keep the vehicle from falling off. So let me walk through these a little bit. First of all, it's all about balance. Keep in mind now, I'm talking about a two-post lift that has the two arms on each side that slide up under the car. So basically what you want to do is look at the vehicle and kind of decide where the center of gravity is on that thing. Now, on a car, it's usually just about where the front of the door is, because the motor is more heavy than the trunk, so you have more weight in the front. So if you split the car exactly in half, you're going to be a little nose heavy. Now, this doesn't have to be perfect exact by any means. These lifts, can take up a lot of slack here, but you do want to get the vehicle fairly balanced according to its center of gravity. Then, when you put your arms out under the vehicle, you want to spread them out as far as possible. In other words, you don't want the two arms in the center of the vehicle. That will allow it to tip forward or tip to the back. And that becomes a real problem with a short wheelbase vehicle like a little CJ5 Jeep or something, because they're so short. And sometimes you have to go out and get really creative to try to get those arms wide enough so the vehicle is not tippy when you lift it up in the air. But you want to spread those things out as far as you can, one toward the back of the car, one toward the front of the car on both sides, and even it out. And if you've got it like that, man, that thing will be super solid on there. Now, here's another thing that people tend to overlook. Once you have a vehicle up on the lift, what kind of work are you going to do? In other words, if you're going to pull out something very heavy like a motor, you need to take that into consideration because you just changed that center of weight. And that's why you've seen the videos of the Corvettes falling off. As soon as they drop the motor out, Corvette flips off the backside. That's because, first of all, they didn't have arms far enough into the back, and they didn't have the center of gravity right, so the whole car was heavy on the tail end. So if you're going to be pulling something out, like a motor that's going to take a lot of weight out, then you need to add auxiliary jacks in the back of the vehicle or in the front, depending on where you're removing stuff, so that doesn't happen. And it's always better to err on the road of caution than to be crazy, because you do have just two posts that are holding all that weight. So it's you do have to be wise about it. And also, a lot of the companies, I don't know what company you're looking at to get your lift from, as you invest in one, most of them just have the flat little pads that go up under frames. And usually that's great for cars. But in trucks, if you'll look up under the frame in the back of a truck, a lot of times those frames angle up. So you'll want to invest in some of the pads that rotate. So they'll rotate up and fit up solid against that frame. Get as many accessories as you can get. Make sure that you get a lift that is strong enough for what you're going to be lifting up. And this last one is really important. Make sure you find out how thick your concrete needs to be. Most of your lifts should be on at least 6 inches of concrete. Some of them say less than that, but I don't recommend. If you're going to pick up anything heavy, anything over 7,000 pounds, you need to have at least 6 inches, maybe more. And you kind of need to know how much rebar is in that concrete as well. If it's a warehouse floor or something, that's great. If it's something that you've done in your garage, yeah, you need to be really careful with that, because a lot of times when people are building garages, they only put the concrete about 4 inches because it's a garage. They're not going to do heavyweight stuff in there. If that's the case and your concrete is not thick enough, your only choice is to do drop a couple pads of concrete where those arms are going to go, or you need to get a 4-post lift, the drive-on style, and do that. Like I said, it's pretty self-explanatory. It's all about weight and balances and be careful, when you take it up in the air, and you won't have any problem, Bart. It'll be a great tool. Once you have one, you won't ever want to be without one, that's for sure. Good luck to you, man. All right, that wraps it up for us today. Make sure that you check out the Gears TV website. We got all kinds of cool stuff there. We got a couple new die casts coming out. Got some books coming out. We have all kinds of things going on. But the most important thing is get out there and turn some wrenches yourself. Get a project. If you don't have one, start working on it. And if you don't have tools, check out Cornwell. They can help you out there.